Today I thought we'd look at collision in Unreal Engine, especially look at trace channels, object channels, collision presets, and where these settings are in the engine and how you can change them. So first of all, I've just downloaded from the starter pack. I've got this door and I've got this cactus from Quixel Bridge. I mean, if we just play straight away, in the default state I can just walk through both of these. There is no collision. If I click on the door, and if we go across to the details and come down to the collision, the default, when it comes through as collision preset default. So what exactly does that mean? If you read it, it says this is the preset specified in the static mesh asset. So if we Control E or Command E and open that asset, so now we have the asset here. If we look in the details and we go down to collision, it says collision preset block all, collision complexity project default. So again, what does this project default mean? So it says collision trace behavior by default will keep simple, and this is stored somewhere in the project physics settings. So if we go back to open our settings, our project settings, and if we maybe just type complexity, under engine physics simulation, we get this default shape complexity, which is simple and complex. So again, if you go down here, engine physics, and in the simulation you have access to a lot of details that can be set. So the default shape complexity is simple and complex. Close that and we go back to our door. So when it's simple and complex, we're obviously walking straight through it. If we look to see if we've got any collision on here, we can say show simple collision. We don't have any. We do have complex collision. So we could change that to use complex collision as simple. In the collision presets, it's set as block all. So as you can see, all of these are ticked to block. We go back and play again. Now we can't walk through the door, so we go straight through it. We are blocked by it. We look at the cactus, which we were also walking straight through, so Command D or Control E to open the static mesh asset, and we go down to the collision. Again, it is set as block all, but it's not blocking anything. And the collision complexity is project default. So again, if I just change that to either simple as complex or complex as simple, if I show collision again, so there's simple there, there's complex. Let's just see if we have collision here now. So yeah, so now we've got collision using complex as simple, or we could use simple as complex. So that gives us collision on both of our assets. But again, here you've got a lot of collision presets that have been set. And they've got collision responses, trace responses, and object responses. So where are these details being set? And what do they actually mean? So if we go back to our project settings and we come down here from engine to collision, we notice that there are lots of information stored here, and these are the presets which are available. So the default preset in those mesh actors assets was block all, which is collision enabled query and physics, and the object type is wall static. And this is where object types are set as object channels, and these are trace channels. So what's the difference between a trace channel and an object channel? So a trace channel will determine or define how an object will respond when we run a trace or a raycast against it. So if we do a line trace or a sphere trace, the trace channel will determine what the outcome is. The object channel, on the other hand, determines what happens when two objects collide, i.e. a physical collision. Do they overlap and go through each other, or do they block each other? And how two different objects respond to an object channel is based on how each of those objects has been sort of ticked to respond. So what's interesting here, if you hover over it, says, so in a Mac command and option, it actually gives you a pop-up with some nice information on it. So trace channels determine how actors respond when you run a trace query. And that's worth reading. And if we look at the object channel, it says object channels are used when engine tests for collisions between moving objects and when you run your own collision queries. So that's interesting to read. Didn't realize that it gave you that information. So if we look at why we would want to add our own object channels and trace channels. So let's say in our game we have interactable objects like doors and windows and treasure chests, and say we have pick-upable objects. So things like this cactus or a coin and so forth. And when a player is actually looking in the direction of these types of objects, running a line trace, we want it to be able to determine which one is which based simply on the trace channel or the object channel of each object. So instead of using things like the visibility channel, which all of them might block, and then having to test whether it's casting to a door class or a cactus class, or whether it has an interface or not, we can do a lot of that work just by setting specific trace channels and object channels on our different actors. So how do you create a new trace channel or object channel? Again, if we go back to our project settings, go to our collision, you can just click on new trace channel and new object channel. So if we wanted to do line traces that only traced against an interactable object or a pick-upable object, we could create two trace channels just for that. So our first one might be interactable, and we'll just say trace channel so we can see what it looks like. And then we can say that the default response for everything is ignore, because we only want to set this to block for a particular type of object. So we'll set the default as ignore, we'll accept. We could also create an object channel for an interactable. So we could say new object channel, and we could say this is an interactable OC object channel, and again the default will be to ignore. We could then, if you look here, you can create presets. So if you click on a block all, it shows you that you can then put the name, you can say whether collision is enabled or not and what type. You can define the object type, which would be in the object channel, and you can give a description and then define how it responds to types of traces or when it collides with other objects. So if we create a preset of our own, we'll say new, we'll call this the interactable. That's our interactable preset. Let's just make it clear. We'll say collision, we want it to collide and be able to do query. So line traces and collision, we both want to be present. So we'll say collision enabled, query and physics. The object type, well, we created our own object type here, interactable object channel. And the description we can just put for interactable actors. Now in the collision response, we have to then define what we want it to block, overlap, or ignore. Well, we want it to block the default for interactable is ignore, but we want that to actually block. So we'll tick that to true. And we want it to also block the interactable trace channel. So only objects of this type with this preset will block both the trace channel and the interactable object channel. And we can then accept it. If we just save it, we should, when we click on our door again, go to our collision, details, collision. The collision presets, we should be able to pick our interactable preset. And now everything that we set up in the project settings is true here. So if we now open our player character, we can test to see whether that line trace is only hitting the interactable door. So if we do an event tick, we can say line trace by channel, and we can test our interactable channel. So in the trace channel, by default you get visibility and camera, but now we've created a new trace channel called interactable trace channel. We can put debug for 1 frame so we can see it, and we can start from the actor's location. That's where we'll start our trace. We'll get the actor forward vector, multiply that by, say, 3 meters. Add the two together, and that will be where the trace ends. And then we can just see whether we are hitting anything or not. So we can say branch, and if we do, we can say print string, and we can put the name of the object that we're hitting. So hit equals and the hit actor. Now if we start playing, so we're doing a line trace, as you can see from the red. If we hit the cactus, nothing happens. But if we come in and we hit the door, it now says hit door. Nothing else will hit because they're all ignoring the trace channel. So only our door will give a positive result, and then we could tell it to, we could send the interact message and the door would open. Now let's see what happens if we play about with the object channel. So first of all, if we remember, you can see we are actually just going straight through that door again. So why is that happening? Because we were getting blocked by the door before we changed the object type of the door, and that is because the door blocks the interactable object channel, but the character, if we go to our character here, we go on the capsule and we come to its collision preset is a pawn, and by default the pawn, as we told it, ignores the object channel. And this is important to understand when you have collisions, is that if both of them are block, then they will block. If one of them is overlap or ignore, then there will be no blocking. In other words, in terms of which one takes precedence, even though that is the higher priority on block, the overlap or the ignore will be the one that determines the outcome if it is ticked on the other object. So if we actually go here on our pawn and we put it to custom, so everything is the same, but we now go to block on its object channel. So its object response to the interactable object channel, or the interactable object type, is block. Let's see if that changes what happens now. Now when I try to run through it, now I get blocked by it. If I put it to overlap, remember this is a lower priority than the block, but it will trump the block response. Now I try it again, I'll go straight through it. So in order to block, for these two objects to block each other, they both need to be on block. As we said, so they're both block, so now I can't go through it because the object channels will block each other. So one of the big advantages of creating your own object channels and trace channels and presets is it opens up more nodes that you can use when trying to identify other objects. So we did the line trace by channel, we could do line trace by profile. So we could click and now we can test for objects that have our interactable preset. And only those will come through on this side. So we don't need to check when we get a hit, is it an interactable object? We know only those are the ones that will be true on a hit. We've got line trace for objects. So we created an object channel. So here, and the object type, I think you can say make array. And we can now choose our interactable object channel as the object type. So again, the hit, if there is a hit, all of those objects by definition will be of the interactable object type. If you're doing overlaps, so sphere overlap by actors, sometimes you can, so again, you can use object types here. So you can just choose your particular object type. And so you can then take advantage of, in essence, built-in logic of each of these nodes, because you know when you are tracing by a particular profile or object type or by the trace channel, the only objects that will hit are those types of objects. So you don't need to check, you don't need to do a branch or to do any further checks. By definition, if this is true, then this object, this hit actor, will be an interactable type actor. So this is a technique that we can also apply to overlap boxes, because just by changing the responses, we can filter the results that we obtain. So for instance, if we take this collision character and we add a sphere collision and we make that, so make that much bigger. On the sphere collision, if we look at its responses, currently it's the default ones, the overlap all dynamic, but if we change that to custom, we tend to ignore everything except and overlap, because we want it to overlap and not to collide, and overlap the interactable channels. Now what should happen is, on the event on component begin overlap, the only actors that come through should be those which have the interactable trace channel present, either overlap or blocked, or particularly with the preset that we set. So if we test that, so we say print, and we say append, and we just say overlap equals the other actor, And if we just disconnect our line trace, compile, the one thing we will need to do is that on the actual, for overlaps to work, you'll notice that on the sphere, say overlap, the generate overlap events is ticked. That also has to be ticked on the other body that you want to overlap on, otherwise it won't work. So in the static mesh, again, if we just filter for overlap, there's a generate overlap events. Make sure you tick that. Otherwise, if we just try it without, see what happens. So we're walking around, nothing happens. If we tick that to be true, and if we also maybe just show our overlap box, if we play, so now if we overlap the door, you see you get overlap SM door, but if we overlap any other object, we do not get a result. In other words, just by changing the trace channels, we've managed to filter the results that we get only for the objects that we're interested in. So each time we overlap, we get the overlap SM door. So that saves us from having to check what this other actor we are overlapping is. We don't have to cast to a particular actor or check whether it has a gameplay tag or an interface. We know that the node itself will do all the filtering based on the fact that we've told it to ignore all the other channels but only overlap the interactable channels that we created. So there is one extra issue we should look at. So if we disconnect our overlap sphere here, and if we go back to our line trace approach, and if I, for instance, put an object in front of our door, and then we play, what you notice is that even though there is an object in front of the door, we're still getting the interactable hit on the door. And that's because this object, like all other objects, by default are set to ignore the interactable trace channel. So it passes straight through that and actually hits the door behind, which is not what you actually want. So how do you deal with this particular problem? What you probably need to do though is run more than one line trace. So you probably want to do a line trace on the visibility channel first, see if there is a hit, and then do a line trace on the interactable channel and see whether, and then compare the distances of those two traces. And we'd probably need to make some changes in our actual collision preset. So if you go back to our collision preset, to the interactable, we'll probably, what we can tell it to do is to ignore everything, but to block the interactable channel, that channel, and also we'll need it to block the visibility channel, and we'll need it on the object response because we still want to have collision, we'll want with the pawn, we'll need it to block the pawn channel as well. So we'll leave all the others off for the time being. And then what we'll need to do in our actual collision character is we'll need to do a line trace by channel, first on the visibility channel, using the exact same line trace start and end. If there is a hit, so we can branch on that, we can then see whether there is also a hit on the interactable channel. So there is a hit on the trace channel because everything blocks the visibility channel. We then check to see if there is a trace on the interactable channel, and only interactable objects will block this channel. So if there is a hit there on the interactable channel as well, we can get the break this and all we want is the distance. And again here we want the distance. So if our interactable is in front of another object that is only visibility, this should be less than this distance. And if that is true, so we can just maybe do another branch here. Then we have hit our interactable object. Actually, thinking about it, it shouldn't be less. These two should be exactly the same if it's hitting an object that has both visibility and interactability. So we should probably check in to see if they are the same. In other words, are they equal? If these two are equal, we can put that. We can also maybe just put a debug string here just to give us some answers, so we can debug to see what actor we're hitting on the visibility channel. Maybe give that a different color. And then if it hits both channels, we'll check to see if the distance is exactly the same as it should be for an object that has both interactability and visibility, and then it will tell us the interactable hit. So let's give that, if we play. So when we come here, we're hitting the cube only, and we're not hitting the door behind it. And if we come from this side, so we're hitting the door and we're getting the interactable hit equals SM door, but we're not hitting the cube behind it. So that's how you can do two line traces in order to make sure that the object that you are hitting is the first object that you want to hit. And if I hadn't mentioned it, the cube settings, if I click on that cube, go to collision, it's got the default settings, which again are to ignore the interactable, trace channel and object channel. So I said with the cactus, we can do exactly the same. So we could add another trace channel, project settings, collision. So another trace channel or object channel, and you can call it pick up trace channel, ignore, and then you would have access to that on any other object or actor in order to use that information to filter results that you are getting, or to decide whether there is object collision or not.